is the Dresser Lumber and Tie Company portion of Lake Elmo Hardwood Incorporated, a whole operation devoted to turning trees into boards. This is big business because the demand for wood and for wood products is so great. And why shouldn't it be? Wood's such a wonderful material. Its texture, its color, its very nature make it one of the most pleasant materials with which to work. And even after these trees have all been felled and reduced into so many board feet of planking, wood still seems to have a life, or perhaps better said, an afterlife of its own. Because wood is both warm and beautiful and strong and durable, it makes an ideal choice for flooring. Ironically, hardwood used to be considered a kind of poor man's floor, and that attitude fostered the kind of slipshod installation techniques which gave us problems like separating boards, wavy boards, and the like. Nevertheless, you can still find plenty of older homes which boast beautiful hardwood floors. Floors which may have lost a part of their former luster, but can still return to that former glory if only their owners will take the time to finish them properly. Now, if you want to take it one step further, you can cover an existing floor with this pre-finished wood parquet flooring. Besides parqueting, you have this alternative, pre-finished wood planks. Now, this has a tongue and groove edge, much like a conventional floorboard has, but this product is designed to be glued into place just like the parquet tiles are. I'm Kurt Burbick. Today, Avian and I are going to show you just how easy it can be to restore an existing hardwood floor, to install a beautiful new wood parquet floor, or to achieve the warmth of a new pre-finished plank floor, and all without the painstaking labor of installing a brand new hardwood floor from scratch.
For most do-it-yourself projects, you'll find that the most used and useful tools you probably already have in your toolbox, and are probably quite familiar to you, like a hammer, and a tape measure, a nail set, and then a paint scraper and other painting gear to do your finishing.
What you're likely to need most, though, is two pieces of equipment that few do-it-yourselfers ever own outright. That's a drum sander and an edger.
You can rent these pieces of equipment at your home center or equipment rental at a very reasonable cost.
Just remember when you're working with this kind of a sander,
or any kind of tool for that matter,
that you read the manufacturer's instructions and wear the appropriate safety gear.
See, when sanding it can get pretty dusty, or when applying the finish it can get very toxic smelling, so wearing a mask is recommended.
Now, when you're sanding in a corner or where the floor meets the wall at a baseboard, you'll need this edging tool.
The drum sander just can't get quite close enough to the wall to do a complete sanding job.
Now, you'll notice that both of these pieces of rental equipment come with dust bags. That's because sanding's an incredibly dusty job, and these will help keep that under control.
Most of the rest of the tools and supplies you'll need are almost identical to those you'd need for any wood finishing project or a painting project. You will probably want to have a lamb's wool applicator or brush, a pan or tray for your finish, along with paint scrapers, an orbital sander with sandpaper in various grades, and a pair of goggles, some polyurethane or whatever finish you happen to be using. For cleaning up, some tack cloths, and possibly a shop-type vacuum cleaner, one with plenty of suction, and all the other useful tools required for projects like this.
Avian, there's one more thing you might want to mention.
Like what?
A coat hanger.
A coat hanger? May I ask what we need a coat hanger for?
You may ask, but I'm not going to tell you till later in the show.
I should have figured as much.
We don't want to leave you with the impression that there are only major projects you can do to the floors of your house. For example, if you have a board that squeaks, or is discolored, or badly warped, or chipped or damaged like this board here, you can cut that board out of the floor and replace it with a new one. Now, that's a fairly easy process to do. You can take a saw cut from one end of the board down the center of the damaged board to the other end. Then with a hammer and chisel and a flat bar, you can remove those pieces without damaging the wood on either side of that damaged board. Now, we'll do that with our electric power saw. And we need to set the depth of the saw blade cut so that it doesn't go any deeper than a fraction of an inch beyond the thickness of the board we're trying to remove. We do that by adjusting the table on this saw, which we've already done. What we're going to use here is what's called a plunge cut. That is to say, rather than pushing the saw straight through the wood to get it started, we hold the saw in this position where the table touches the floor up front here. The saw blade is tilted up in the air so the blade isn't touching the wood. Then we pull the guard back and we pull the trigger, and when the blade is spinning, we drop it gently, easing it into the wood without moving the saw either forward or backward. Once the blade has gotten into the wood and the table is flat on the floor, then we can start pushing the saw through the board to the other end, being careful not to push the saw too far so it doesn't damage the good board beyond this one, or starting too close to this good board at this end and thereby damaging that. Now, before you do this cut, of course, you must always remember to put on your safety goggles first. A little more work with this chisel, getting this wood out of here. Just work your way along the board. Then you can use the pry bar. Carefully measure and cut your board, and then with a saw, cut the tongue off the edge of the board so it'll fit into the slot better. And also chisel the tongue off the board that's in the floor, again to allow this board to fit better. Then when your board is in there, you can glue it into place, and you can pre-drill and face nail this board down. So now when you sand your floor, you'll have a floor without a broken board in it.
You're probably familiar with walking across a wooden floor and hearing it creak and groan under your feet. Well, all that is a board that's loosened up due to natural expansion and contraction. And when you put your weight on it, it rubs against the nail and makes a noise, a lot like a cricket rubbing its legs together. We have this illustration up here to show you how a floor is constructed so that you might better understand how to repair these ills. These are called floor joists, and they support your entire floor system. Then on top of that is the subfloor, and then finally on top of that are your hardwood flooring planks. Now, once you've located your squeaky boards, repairing them is a pretty simple matter. An easy solution is to pre-drill through your floor so that you can then nail into your floor, through the subfloor, and possibly into your joist. Now, this same method can work for warp boards if they're not too badly warped. If your floor system is on the first level, you can go downstairs to your basement and you may find that your floor joists are exposed, in which case you can screw up through your joist, your subfloor, and into your flooring and pull it down tight. Now, should you need more support than that, you might install some bridging between your joists. It's usually made up of a 2x4 or a 2x6, and that'll give you some more support to nail into. Now, when you find boards that are rubbing up against each other, fill them with some graphite or some wood dough. Okay, with these solutions in mind, Kurt's going to show you some answers to another little problem.
If you've got some chips and cracks in your floor like we've got here, you don't have to worry about trying to pull up the boards to patch it. Just get yourself some wood dough and try to match the color to the color of the boards in your floor and patch these cracks. Now, you need to do this just before you do your last sanding, and this wood dough will take staining and finishing pretty much like the boards will.
There are a lot of hardwood floors around that look like a mess, but structurally they're sound and actually have got years of useful life left. Now, there are three things you can do to a badly worn floor. You can refinish it, cover it, or if it's really bad, replace it. Today, the first thing we're going to show you how to do is how to refinish a hardwood floor. In fact, one of the virtues of hardwood flooring is that they can be restored to a new or nearly new condition with just a little patience and care. There are three steps involved. What you want to do is sand the entire floor area, then stain if desired. Then we apply a protective finish over the clean, bare wood.
Before we can sand, we've got to get a couple of basics out of the way. First, you need to get your hammer and your nail set and countersink some of the nail heads in this floor. I mean, something as sharp as a nail head isn't going to be very friendly to your sandpaper.
And another thing we've already taken care of is we removed the shoe moldings along the baseboard, carefully of course. That way we can sand as close as possible to the baseboards. Now if we'd had loose floorboards, we'd want to fix those. And we'll be talking in general about floor repairing later on in the show. Now before you turn on your sander, give your floor an extra careful sweeping and make sure that you've got adequate ventilation, as sanding can raise a lot of dust and putting on the finish itself can get pretty fumy.
The next thing we need to do is sand the old finish off this floor. And if we do this right, we'll not only be able to take the dirt that's been ground in here, but we'll be able to take away the staining and discoloration problems too.
Actually, cutting through your old floor finish may not be the only thing you need to accomplish with your sanding. You may have boards that are cupped or warped, or ridges where the floorboards come together that you want to smooth out. If you take a diagonal pass across your floorboards with a coarse grade of sandpaper on your machine, that should do the trick. Now, Kurt, what grade sandpaper are you using here?
Well, I'm starting out with this coarse grade first.
Why so coarse?
Well, take a look at the shape this floor's in.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Now, getting your sandpaper installed in the drum properly is extremely important, because if you don't, you're going to have problems. The sandpaper might tear and the machine will throw it out all over the room. Also, you're going to have to replace the sandpaper often, because the friction caused by the sandpaper turning so fast tends to melt the finish on the floor, and then it'll clog the sandpaper up pretty quickly. So just buy lots of sandpaper, and what you don't use up, you can return and get your money back.
You never want to turn the machine on with the drum in direct contact with the floor. The sanding pattern becomes a series of straight lines, moving from one end of the room to the other. For any repositioning, make sure the drum is off the floor, or you'll almost undoubtedly leave sanding marks. Kurt's going with the grain of the floorboards. If he didn't do that, he'd never get the wood smooth. Another tip, overlap the edge of your last pass on each succeeding pass. You'll have less trouble with sanding marks that way and get a much more even finish. To really get it as tight as you should to the wall, use an edge sander.
I use this file to sharpen this really simple scraping tool, and if I keep it really sharp, it'll do a great job in helping me get these hard-to-reach places, like under the radiator. I've finished the first complete sanding of the whole floor, and now that I've removed all the old finish and freed the floor of the minor imperfections of cupping and ridging in the boards, I can load my drum sander with this finer grade paper and go back and get the floor even smoother. When it comes time to actually finishing your wood floors, you've basically got two ways to go. One, you can apply a stain to the wood that'll color and darken it before you apply a protective finish. And two, you can apply a surface finish that will protect the wood without changing its color. But no matter what you do to this raw wood floor, before you put anything on it, you've got to give it a thorough cleaning. And that means sweeping and vacuuming, and as some pros recommend, a final wipe down with a tack cloth. Now, the easiest and most popular surface finish in use today is polyurethane, and it comes in two surface looks. One, a clear gloss finish, and two, a satin finish. And we're going to choose clear gloss to put on our floors. Now, when working with polyurethane, it's really critical that you stir it up well before applying it, because the hardeners in polyurethane tend to settle toward the bottom of the can. And if you don't stir them up, you won't get a proper finish on your wood. Now, let me show you a trick with this, and it's one that can be used with painting. You can take a coat hanger and bend it and stick it in your electric drill and use it as a stirrer. Now, it's only important that when you're doing this, you stir it very slowly so that you don't whip a lot of bubbles into the polyurethane. Now, also when working with polyurethane, it's important that you have good ventilation in the room. Keep the windows open, and even think about putting a fan in the window. And use a respirator-type mask so you can filter the fumes. Now, you may be wondering about those holes we put in the floor when we were countersinking the nails earlier. What I recommend here is just to put wood dough in those holes before you start your sanding. Well, let's get started.
You'll probably find that a lamb's wool applicator is a real effective way for getting your polyurethane on the floor. All it takes is mopping the finish onto the floor, moving in the direction of the grain. So once you've got your coat of finish down, let it dry thoroughly. Now, drying time is often a function of humidity and temperature, but if you've got any kind of tackiness at all, give it a while longer, but 24 hours should be plenty long enough. So once your finish is dry, you'll find that it's kind of rough, especially after your first coat. It's essential that you sand between each and every coat with a fine grade of sandpaper. We're going to be doing 3 coats here on this floor. Well, you can see this wasn't particularly hard to do, and a considerable contrast from the floor we started with, if you remember. Oh, by the way, about staining. You can't get away with the same minor imperfections that you can if you're just using a polyurethane or a penetrating finish. The flaws and the rough spots will get picked up by the stain and show darker. So if you're going to stain your floor, give it an extra fine sand. But as for our floor, we're wrapped up. So let's push on to the parquet flooring project.
We decided to install wood parquet in our dining room, but when we got into preparing it, we found a lot of serious problems with this old floor. The kinds of things that would come from those slipshod installation techniques we discussed at the beginning of the program.
The floors were bumpy and uneven. They weren't even level, and the corners dropped down lower than the main part of the floor. All in all, the surface of the floor was really bad, even for a house this old.
The best solution, we agreed, was to put an underlayment down, and we did that. But before we did that, we filled all the dished and seriously dipped areas with a leveling compound. Then we installed the plywood and began filling the cracks.
Yeah, this may seem like an extreme solution, but it's really not that hard to fix. An underlayment is simply a thin, tough layer of plywood that you lay over your floor surface to create a smooth, even, level surface for your parquet.
When installing underlayment, the best nailing pattern you can use is about every 3 inches along the edges and roughly every 12 inches out in the middle. And for the best holding power, use these 6-penny ring shank nails. Now at the outside edges, leave a gap between your underlayment plywood and the baseboard to allow for some expansion to avoid warping and buckling of the floor over time.
Another prep step is to undercut the jamb so that we can fit the edge of our parquet flooring underneath without having to notch around. So what I did is I took a scrap of parquet flooring, put it right up against the jamb, and then I take a handsaw and run it flat across the top so it acts as a cutting guide and it gives me the correct clearance height. Okay, so it looks like we're about ready to install our flooring. Parquet is a gorgeous floor, and one of its great features is you don't have to spend an eternity on your knees nailing down each and every little wooden piece to get a beautiful result. Mostly parquet comes in prefabricated, pre-finished square tiles and is about as easy to install as a vinyl square tile. Now, Kurt, what special considerations do we need to know about installing this floor?
You mean about planning your floor layout?
Right. I was wondering if we need to snap the lines just like we do to install the vinyl square tiles.
Yeah, it's very much the same.
Well, why don't I start getting the working lines together while you explain it?
Okay. All right, the proper installation method for parquet tiles in a rectangular room like ours is to divide the room into quadrants and then start putting mastic adhesive and parquet tiles from the center of the room out toward the corners in 4 directions. So, to establish our layout lines to divide the room into those quadrants, it's very important that we get that method done correctly. Here's how you do it. Measure along the 2 short walls of your room and find the midpoints, up here and down here. And you'll find when you do that measurement, you'll discover that this dimension is not the same as this dimension. Don't be concerned about that. All rooms are like that. These walls won't be perfectly parallel. In fact, the reason for using this method that I'm showing you is to divide that error of these walls being out of parallel along both sides of the room rather than putting all of the error along one wall when you do your tile layout. Now, after doing that, measure over from this mark 6 inches here and 6 inches up here, and snap a line from those two marks from one end of the room to the other. That's your first layout line. And why, you may ask, did I move over 6 inches rather than using the first center line marks in the room? That's because if you use this as the layout line, you'll find that your makeup courses at the outside walls will be more than half a tile, as opposed to having skinny courses of tile at each edge, which you'd get if you started from the center line. So now the next thing you need to do is establish a line in this direction, perpendicular to this line that's somewhere in the middle of the room. And here you'll make a decision. As with our house, we have a dining room next to a living room, so there's an important relationship between these two floors. They meet in this wide opening between the two rooms. So we want a full course of tiles down at this end of the room rather than a cut makeup course down here. So we'll start from this wall, measure up halfway along the two walls along the outside here, about half the dimension of the room. Our room is about 18.5 feet long. So we're going to measure up 9 feet because we want this full 12-inch course down here. Put a mark on each side of the wall 9 feet from this corner and snap a line across here. Now, it's very important that this angle be 90 degrees or a right angle. So there's a way to check this by using a 3-4-5 triangle as a way of establishing whether this is truly perpendicular, these two lines. Here's how you do it. Measure up here 4 feet, 1, 2, 3, 4. Measure out here 3 feet, 1, 2, 3, and measure between these 2 points. If this dimension is in fact 5 feet, then you've got a 3, 4, 5 triangle. And the rule is that the angle opposite the long side of a 3, 4, 5 triangle is always exactly 90 degrees. If it isn't quite 5 feet, adjust this line just enough so that this does become 5 feet, and then you will have established a 90-degree angle, and you have gotten your room now divided into the 4 working quadrants. You can start applying adhesive in your tiles to complete this project. Well, once you get your working lines laid out, that's time to start spreading your adhesive.
One thing you want to be sure of is to keep your adhesive in your tiles at or as close to 70 degrees as possible. And the way you do that is store your materials in the room that you're going to install them near that temperature for a good 24 hours beforehand.
And you want to spread the adhesive with a toothed trowel like this one. And it's important to say here that you should read the manufacturer's instructions very carefully and follow them to the letter. That's what we're doing here. And that means using the tooth trowel that they recommend you use.
Keep your trowel at a consistent angle like I'm doing here, and you'll get ridges and more or less an even coating. Wipe away any excess blops that might squish up between the seams in your tiles.
Once you've got the mastic spread in the area you started out to cover, you might want to take a break at this point, because a lot of the manufacturers recommend that you let this mastic set up for about an hour before you start applying the tiles. That way the mastic will have the proper stickiness or tackiness to give a good hold to those tiles as you press them into the adhesive. Another thing to be careful about is not to cover an area that's so big that you can't then come back with the wood parquet pieces and cover that same area within 2.5 to 3 hours. Because after that time, the mastic is going to be a little bit too dry to have good holding power. You got the first one?
We let an hour go by, and now we're hard at it again.
As you press these tiles into place, you want to make sure you avoid excessive sliding because the mastic is a little soft. Now, the first tile you put in place, it's very important that that be positioned properly, because that's going to set the pattern for the rest of the tiles. Then you put the second and third tile on either side of this, and the fourth tile is right up on the top. And what you're trying to do here is set a pyramid fashion of putting these tiles in place. It's a very good idea to keep a rag handy with some paint thinner on it to keep yourself clean and to keep this adhesive cleaned up off the floor surface. Now, as you can see here, we've got a gap on this side of the room. It's going to equal the gap on the other side because of the way we did our layout. What you have to do is cut the pieces to fit that gap. And I cut them so that there's a slight space between the edge of this board and the baseboard, so that when this gets pressed and glued into place, we can come back with some shoe molding that will cover up that little gap.
Since we're joining two different types of flooring, and this parquet is about a ½ inch higher than our refinished floor, we're using what's called a reducer strip, which is a nice piece of oak milled at a slant to compensate for that difference in floor height. Now to attach it, I'll just pre-drill it and then use some finish nails and maybe go over it with a little wood dough to cover up that hole. So once you've got your floor into place, you want to press it firmly into the adhesive. And an efficient way to do that is to rent a 150-pound roller from your home center and go over the entire floor area. So now we come back around and cover up our gaps with trim. Now if you were careful in removing your old trim, you can probably reuse it. If you're going to use new trim and want to paint it before you install it, then come back around and touch it up.
It's hard to believe that this intricate pattern of small wood pieces was actually so easy to install. The whole project only took a spare weekend, and it's added real warmth and beauty to this room. Now let's go take a look at what's involved with installing pre-finished plank flooring.
So I'm spreading the adhesive over the entire working area, covering the corners, along the edges, and all the way to the straight edge. Then the planks will start running right here at the straight edge, working out. Now I've got the straight edge tacked into position, so we've got a good solid base to push our boards up against without going out of line.
Well, it looks like this adhesive is ready to go, so I'm going to start installing this first plank. And it just goes right up against our straight edge, up against the baseboard. Press it down into the glue. And we're ready for our second piece, which is now going to be the 3-inch wide piece. Fit the tongue of this piece into the groove of the first piece. And the end of this board wants to be at least 5 inches away from the end of this one. Then I've got a little tapping board here. I can fit the tongue in here, bringing this board up snug against the first piece that I put in. So now I'm just going to add some more planks, build up and out all the way to the wall on the other side of the room.
Just like the parquet, you want to lift up your planks every now and then to make sure you're getting good contact with the adhesive.
I'm just installing this last piece of 5-inch wide planking, and as you can see, it fits snugly up against the baseboard here because of the way we planned our layout line. Now we had to cut and fit some special pieces on the other side of the room, much like we did downstairs with the parquet flooring. Now in a remodel job, you'll find that an installed floor like this always ends up going up against the baseboard. So you need to cover up the crack around the room, and for that you can use what's called shoe molding. We're going to use this quarter round piece, and it'll just cover up the crack like this all the way around.
Well, cleanup's pretty simple. Most companies make or recommend a solvent or cleaner to remove their adhesive products. Now you want to clean your good tools before the adhesive has a chance to dry hard on your tool. To remove the excess stuff on your floor, put your remover on a clean cloth and just wipe it off. Don't ever put the remover right on the floor, as you could damage the finish.
One question that comes up all the time is, how do you keep a floor that looks like this looking like this? So here's some do's and don'ts. Don't add a finish to a pre-finished floor. And don't regularly wet mop a pre-finished floor. And don't try to sand or refinish a pre-finished floor, because it's fairly thin stuff. And without the help of a professional, you're liable to permanently damage this kind of floor. And to prolong the life of a hardwood floor and its beauty, a little basic maintenance is all that's required. An occasional sweeping or dust mopping or even vacuuming. And in an area that's high trafficked and is beginning to show some wear, you might think about adding some wax and occasionally buffing that. But you should always use the floor manufacturer's recommended product, so you'll know that it's compatible with this factory finish. As you've seen in the last half hour, nothing can match the feel of real wood or a real wood floor. Few materials can match its sheer staying power, the incredible durability of wood.